אהבת עולם, בית ישראל, עמך.
Shabbat Shalom. Welcome. Bruchim Abiyim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. You found Beit Virtuali, and let's stir up a little Torah together. And with that in mind, time travel. Of all the fantastical journeys and wishes from my imagination from childhood, this one is traveled the most poorly. The fantasy of time travel is often bound up in one of two impossibilities. The first is the paradox-creating desire to change something in our personal past or that of the greater world in order to avoid something personally or collectively horrible. This has been described as the baby Hitler fallacy. If only we could go back and, well, hopefully I don't need to describe the rest of this thought. And hopefully, in addition, we have watched enough Star Trek to understand the dangers. The potential paradoxes, the time loops.
Suggestions? Decompress main shuttle bay. The explosive reaction may blow us out of the way.
The attempts for each new series to figure out a more interesting way to portray time travel.
If we want to save the future, then we have to repair the past.
The second fantasy usually involves some desire to see some great event or some great personage of the past. The only problem is the further we move before the recordings of GoPros and the developments of, the Enlightenment and modernity, we don't really want to see those events, and we don't really want to meet those heroes. Or were we to meet those heroes, they probably would not remain our heroes. And those events even further in the past, they really did not happen the way we imagine, and the ways our dogmas and ideologies tell us they absolutely must have. This all is not meant to engage in the fallacy of believing that had I met Thomas Jefferson, that I would have been able to convince him to not have slaves, for example. Living in the 18th century, by definition of living in the 18th century, cannot confer the benefits of later centuries of moral evolution. Had we been born at an earlier time, we would have seen the world through the eyes of that time. End stop. Saying that the patina of heroism would disappear should we meet those luminaries of the past is not the same as making a claim that they lacked any merit or should not be seen as meritorious today. Rather, it is a claim that our merit must always be seen from the perspective of the time that gave rise to that merit. Hopefully it goes without saying that that counts for us too. Those of us that bask within the knowledge of our perfection and moral superiority over another in that group would probably be shocked to see the condemnation that future generations will level upon us for not living up to their insights that they developed over the next centuries that have not yet occurred for us. And yet we, nonetheless, often do engage in a specific type of time travel, a time travel that is real and tangible to the person who is doing that time travel. In our illusions of rationality, we see ourselves as travelers in an invariable stream of linear time. Certain experiences testify to this and etch this in our consciousness. If it takes, for example, 10 days after a surgery for physical pain to dissipate, then after 11 days, that specific pain will be gone. And we can look back and objectively measure the distance from the worst of it to the absence of it, remembering eventually only the fact of it. Without similar injury, we will never remember the reality of that pain. This is not, however, the case with our emotional lives. You walk out into a warm breeze, smell the emergence of a specific blossom, and the pain or the warmth in your heart is not the barely remembered fact from 30 years in the rearview mirror. You are there within that memory that arises. You step into a pub and you pull up a stool next to your best friend that you also just haven't seen in 10 or 20 years. And you continue the conversations that you had, as well as the deep and unending connections of love that have bound you from within the last iteration of this moment. Your eyes brush across a photograph as you're lighting a candle for a parent's yahrzeit. And the tears burning down your face are not the tears of now, they're the tears of then, as if there was no difference between the two. Because in this type of normal time travel, there really is no difference. This was the subtext last week as we looked at how Joseph's incomprehensible games with his brothers became utterly comprehensible when looked at through the lens of an adult who had experienced and not yet dealt with childhood trauma. You know, the whole being thrown down in a pit by your brothers and sold to slavers by your brothers thing. We would have as well been traumatized. The implicit subtext of the Joseph story becomes one of a type of time travel, as he is acting as powerful, adult, grown-up Joseph from within his own narrative. How much of this Joseph is the one that has lived in that linear time and has matured through those linear steps in time? And how much of those decisions are made by the Joseph that is still in the pit? How many times did a memory of something happening around him force him back inside of that darkness? How many times did he choose to be there? This week, the implicit becomes explicit. In Parashat Vayechi, the last chapters of Genesis, the narrative returns to Jacob Israel as he asks his son Joseph to swear to bury his body with his fathers and not in Egypt. All right, understandable. How many of us, if we've actually thought about it, wish to be buried in some specific place and would certainly never want to be buried in another specific place? The story continues with Jacob's adoption of Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, so that they might have equal shares in the inheritance of the house of Israel. Also reasonable enough. Also, truth be told, politically required for the future legitimacy of the northern kingdom of Israel. But that's a story for another day or another book. What is not necessarily so reasonable or understandable or clear on the surface are the words that Jacob utters during the adoption ceremony. To make sense of this before we hear Israel's words, it helps us to personally imagine or remember, if we have personally witnessed this, what is actually said on a deathbed. If we have never witnessed this, we might be forgiven for assuming that the best of us is in that moment represented. We might imagine ourselves in that position, offering blessings to all those that are present, asking about great-grandchildren that are not there because they're in Stockholm writing their acceptance speech for their Nobel Prize. And indeed, I have been by a few bedsides where a calm person who has found some measure of peace in their lives is asking about family, crying with memories, holding hands, and yes, offering blessings. I have also been at the ones where the very real pain that a very mortal body is experiencing breaks down our ability to be our best selves. Some words uttered in these moments are not necessarily words of blessing. These are things we seldom discuss. These are things that are quite uncomfortable. What those moments most often carry is the unsevered link to the most oft-visited time travel destination of the person who is about to pass. Jacob's words seem to be exactly this. And Jacob said to Joseph, El Shaddai appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and the Eternal blessed me and said to me, I will make you fertile and numerous, making you a community of peoples, and I will assign this land to your offspring to come for an everlasting possession. Now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, shall be mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, no less than Reuben and Simeon. I do this because when I was returning from Padan, Rachel died, to my sorrow, while I was journeying in the land of Canaan, when still some distance short of Ephrath, and I buried her there on the road to Ephrath, now Bethlehem. Sandwiched between two time-traveling truths is the meat of what's happening. Jacob, or in this moment specifically Israel, is adding his grandchildren, Ephraim and Manasseh, to the list of tribes, his direct inheritance in their own right. The time travel truths are easy to miss because we seldom pause long enough to read what's actually being said. At his hour of death, Jacob remembers the promise of the Eternal, that I, the Eternal, will make you fertile and numerous. Except that this is being said to a Jacob who, without the goodwill of his son Joseph, would be dead for starvation due to the 7-year famine that had also plagued Canaan and forced the rest of his sons to come down to Egypt to seek survival in the first place. The fulfillment of this promise, narratively, does not happen in Jacob's lifetime beyond the birth of his children. Nearly the opposite happens. Extinction. Jacob doesn't see the fulfillment of this promise, and yet it's the first thing on his lips. The land that shall be an everlasting possession is not in his possession. It is far to the north, and in the Tanakh narrative will not be in the possession of the house of Israel until after centuries, slavery, exodus, plagues, conquest. Moreover, the text in the book of Judges makes it clear that some tribes didn't even do what they were supposed to do in the conquest, and essentially this promise never came true. Is it any wonder that this is on Jacob's mind? If we reestablish the humanity of our ancestors, to see them as humans in the way that we are humans, is it not reasonable to assume that Jacob's 17 years in Egypt often included that special kind of time travel back to that promise from the Eternal? You know, because Jacob was in Egypt and not in the land of that promise. Why do you think the Torah calls it our promised land and not our present land? The statement of Jacob to Joseph is not the victory lap of a satisfied old man. It is a wail and an appeal for this promise to be fulfilled in his children and grandchildren. The other time travel destination of Jacob feels even closer to home. I'm going to do this. I'm going to adopt your sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, because of Rachel? How does this statement make sense? Commentaries explain this in various ways, such as Rashi's concept of recompense, that Joseph, as Rachel's son, would blame his father for an inappropriate burial of his mother, and so Jacob made teshuvah through the adoption of Ephraim and Manasseh. There is, however, a much more basic psychological explanation. In the 17 years that Jacob lived in Egypt, where was he? Better, when was he? When he sat out on a veranda overlooking a land that was not his land, his promised land. Was he present there? Explicitly, no. He was time traveling, existing fully and completely from within the two moments that kept drawing him back over and over. A promise unfulfilled and the real regrets surrounding the death of a beloved partner. In a very real way, Jacob, in that moment, while speaking to Joseph, was not there. He was in that conversation with the Eternal. He was standing by that road, crying, looking at a hastily dug grave. Where are you right now? Where am I? Since you started listening to this video, how often have you been present elsewhere? Where were you? When were you? I can tell you that as I was writing the script for this video, I had to stop over and over again as I kept on finding myself trying to make a snarky point to get a pound of flesh that came from some unhealed moment of my past. I was trying to write in the present, but I was actually writing from my past. There's a difference between accessing resources and memories and where we are present in that moment. And the reality of how we mostly function as humans is that unless I am engaging truly, honestly, daily in a spiritual practice that keeps me grounded in the present, we exist constantly within this sort of time travel. We are not here. We are drawn elsewhere, over and over. Add on to this our personal illusions. Our default narrative mode is to be the hero of our own story. Simultaneously, as we age and have more places outside of the present to which we are continuously drawn, it slowly dawns on us, at least unconsciously, or through the truth of our dreams, that our actions haven't always been so heroic. Yet that dawning, or dreaming, is not exactly the same as facing that reality, of doing the real work to overcome. If we went back in a literal time machine to meet an earlier version of ourselves or to view an important event from our own lives, some part of us knows that we really don't want to meet an earlier version of ourselves any more than we would want to actually have dinner with Mozart. Our egos develop partially to insulate ourselves from our foolishness of our past selves, much in the same way that it keeps on developing to stick a thin layer of veneer on top of the full truth of who we are today. But part of the secret of evolving past the version of ourselves that needs to be hidden behind that ego is being honest with ourselves regarding our time travel destinations. If I am constantly traveling to the same conversation, that same meeting, that same argument, that same bedside, then those are the places that I have left enough of my soul that I cannot go on with my life without getting them back. Jacob had to pass on the promise of the Eternal to his children and grandchildren because it was not fulfilled through him, and his dying days seem to have been filled with that regret. He sets up everything for the future, but lingers from within an unfilled promise and the vision of his dearest love whose memory he wronged, exactly as we do in the middle of a sleepless night, or worse, from our deathbed, as we try to make sense of all of the time travel destinations that have not been resolved. The most powerful thing about the iterative question that arises from this Parashat is that it's easy to answer. It's just hard to ask. The question is, where do we go? Or when do we go? But asking the question requires us to acknowledge the 2, 3, 4 events that most haunt us, or forces us to consider those 2, 3, 4 people that we most wronged. The question ultimately does not get asked because of the cognitive dissonance that accompanies this type of time travel. We keep on going back because we're caught in a time loop. And the cause of this time loop is the uncomfort that facing our real actions, our real history brings, and how it contradicts how we see ourselves in the present. If I'm time traveling over and over to the death of a relative, it is most likely because there was something profoundly unsettled at the death of that relative. And that unsettling has a pretty darn good chance of being something unheroic that we did or said. The way we remember and pass on our stories often has as much to do with what actually happened as an ideal Instagram photo has to do with the actual life of the person in that photo. The price to pay for not asking and not answering honestly is the time loop. We will be stuck there until we do ask the question and answer the question and resolve the contradiction. We will lie awake at night next to someone beloved who needs our full awareness and be fully present in a trauma that took place around the time that we were still listening to 8 tracks. Jacob is one of the names that we call out to from within inside Jewish prayer. Elohei Yaakov, we utter at the beginning of the Amidah. We enter the central prayer of Jewish liturgy through the foundational names of our foundational figures. This is often phrased something as, it is on account of our ancestors that we are able to approach the eternal. Somehow this truth gets conflated with illusions of heroism. On account of our ancestors' great deeds, we are able to stand in front of the eternal. Yet in Jacob's case, the end of his life was not about great deeds. It was about unfulfilled promises and personal regrets. You know, kind of like most of us normal humans. It is by virtue of that we stand before the eternal? Actually, yes. The eternal is not a dude on a ceiling painting. The eternal, as a narrative symbol for the existence of the universe, cannot be reached if we're not there to reach. This absurd statement seems to go without saying until we go to a concert and at the end realized we haven't heard anything because we were lost the entire time in an argument from that morning. We go to a daughter's school play and we forget to pay attention because of that bill that we just got in the mail that morning. The end of Jacob's narrative is not a coronation of a king. It is a key to the pathway of what it actually means to pray, what it actually means to live. We stand before the eternal only by virtue of recognizing what it is that is distracting us from standing before the eternal, being completely honest with ourselves in that moment regarding where and when we are. Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you next time.
בחצות זרות וקול שופר הריעו לפני המלך אדוני